Dorothy Hale had never been a woman of questions. For 43 years she had been Eddie's wife, and that had been enough. She had learned early that curiosity was a luxury she could not afford. Eddie came home late, smelling of motor oil and cigarette smoke, and she never asked where he had been. He handed her cash in crumpled envelopes, and she never asked where it came from. He kissed her forehead before bed, and she never asked why his knuckles were sometimes bruised, why his eyes sometimes carried the weight of things unsaid. Now, Eddie was gone. The funeral had been small. A handful of men in dark suits stood at the back of St. Anthony's Chapel, their faces shadowed beneath fedoras, their presence heavy with unspoken meaning. They did not approach the casket. They did not offer condolences. They simply watched, and when the service ended, they disappeared like smoke into the cold November air. Father Giuseppe had presided over the burial with his usual solemnity, but Dorothy had noticed the way his hands trembled when he sprinkled holy water over Eddie's grave. She had noticed the way his eyes lingered on the men in the back, the way he crossed himself twice instead of once. 2 weeks after the funeral, Dorothy received a letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, delivered by a boy she did not recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in neat, unadorned text. Mrs. Hale, your husband left you the garage on Crescent Street. The deed is enclosed. The property is yours, free and clear. No questions will be asked. It is advised that you visit the premises soon. There was no signature. Dorothy sat at her kitchen table for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands. The garage on Crescent Street. She had never been there. Eddie had always told her it was just a place where he fixed cars, nothing more. A side business. A way to make extra money. But Eddie was dead, and the men in dark suits had been at his funeral, and Father Giuseppe's hands had trembled. Dorothy folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then she put on her coat, picked up the deed, and walked out into the cold. Crescent Street sat on the edge of Newark's industrial district, where the factories had long since closed, and the buildings stood like hollow monuments to a city that had forgotten them. The garage was at the end of the block, a squat brick structure with rusted metal doors and windows so dirty they might as well have been painted black. Dorothy stood on the sidewalk, staring at the building. She had imagined something different, something cleaner, something that looked like a place where an honest man might have worked. This was not that place. She pulled the key from her purse, another item that had been in the envelope, and approached the side door. The lock resisted at first, then gave way with a reluctant click. The door swung inward, and Dorothy stepped into the darkness. The smell hit her first. Oil, rust, something else beneath it, something faint and sour, like old blood. She fumbled for a light switch and found one near the door. A single bulb flickered to life overhead, casting weak, uneven light across the interior. The garage was larger than it looked from the outside. The main floor was cluttered with car parts, engines, transmissions, wheels, scattered across workbenches and piled in corners. A rusted sedan sat in the center of the space, its hood open, its engine stripped down to the frame. Tools hung from pegboards on the walls, their shapes outlined in faded paint, as if someone had once cared about keeping them organized. But it was the back of the garage that drew Dorothy's attention. There was a door, heavy, metal, painted black. She had not expected a door. Dorothy walked toward it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Her hand reached for the handle, but she hesitated. Behind her, the wind rattled the metal doors of the garage, and for a moment she thought she heard Eddie's voice. "Don't ask questions, Dot. It's safer that way." She turned the handle. The door opened onto a staircase leading down into darkness. Dorothy felt along the wall and found another switch. Another bulb flickered on below, revealing a narrow set of concrete steps descending into a basement. She went down. The basement was colder than the garage above. The walls were bare concrete, damp and grey, and the floor was stained with oil and something darker. There were more workbenches here, but these were different, cleaner, more organized, and the tools were not for fixing cars. Dorothy saw vices, blowtorches, chains hanging from hooks in the ceiling, a large metal drum in the corner, its lid sealed tight. And then she saw the photographs. They were pinned to a corkboard on the far wall, arranged in rows like a family album. But these were not family pictures. These were surveillance photos, black and white, grainy, taken from a distance. Men standing outside restaurants, men getting into cars, men shaking hands in alleyways. Dorothy stepped closer, her breath shallow. She recognized some of the faces, not because she knew them, but because she had seen them before. On the news, in the newspapers. Men whose names were whispered in connection with disappearances, with trials that never ended in convictions, with violence that was always described as organized. And there, in the center of the board, was a photograph of Eddie. He was standing outside the garage talking to another man, a tall man with silver hair and a long coat. The man's face was partially obscured, but there was something about his posture, about the way Eddie stood beside him, that made Dorothy's stomach turn. She reached out and pulled the photograph from the board. On the back, in Eddie's handwriting, were 2 words: Vincent Carbone. Dorothy's hands went numb. Vincent Carbone, underboss of the Carbone family, a name that appeared in the newspapers only in whispers, a man whose power was spoken of in hushed tones even by those who had never met him, and Eddie had known him. Dorothy's mind raced. How long had Eddie been involved with these people? What had he done for them? And why had he never told her? She turned away from the corkboard and saw something else. A filing cabinet in the corner, its drawers slightly ajar. She opened the top drawer and found folders. Dozens of them, each one labeled with a name, a date, a location. She pulled one out at random and opened it. Inside were receipts, bills of sale, shipping manifests, all of them for car parts, but the numbers didn't make sense. A single transmission listed for $5,000, a set of tires for $3,000. These weren't prices for parts. These were prices for something else. Dorothy's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, and then she found it. A handwritten note, tucked between 2 receipts. Delivery confirmed. Shipment moved to safe house. No witnesses. STST Sal Torino. Dorothy had heard that name before. Eddie had mentioned it once, years ago, in passing. A man he worked with. A man who paid well. A man who didn't like loose ends. Dorothy closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. Her heart was pounding. She needed to leave. She needed to lock the door and walk away and forget everything she had seen. But as she turned toward the stairs, she heard something. A sound from above. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Someone was in the garage. Dorothy froze. The footsteps moved slowly across the floor above, pausing near the workbenches, then continuing toward the back, toward the black door. She looked around the basement, searching for another way out. There was none. Only the stairs. The footsteps stopped. Then the door at the top of the stairs opened. Light spilled down into the basement and a shadow fell across the steps. A man's shadow, broad shoulders, a long coat. A voice called down, calm and measured. "Mrs. Hale, I know you're down there." Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. The man descended the stairs slowly, his shoes clicking against the concrete. When he reached the bottom, he stepped into the light. He was older than Dorothy had expected, mid-60s perhaps. Silver hair combed back neatly, a tailored coat over a dark suit. His face was weathered but handsome, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "Vincent Carbone, you shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Dorothy's voice came out as a whisper. "This is my property." "It was Eddie's property," Vincent corrected. "And Eddie knew better than to bring anyone here." "Eddie's dead." "Yes," Vincent said. "He is." The way he said it made Dorothy's blood run cold. Vincent stepped closer, his gaze moving past her to the corkboard, to the filing cabinet, to the photographs scattered across the workbench. "You've seen too much," he said softly. Dorothy's hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what any of this means." "Yes, you do." Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Vincent sighed. Eddie was a good man, loyal, quiet. He did what he was told and never asked questions. That's why he lived as long as he did. "And now?" Dorothy asked, her voice shaking. Vincent's expression did not change. "Now you have a choice, Mrs. Hale. You can walk away, sell the property, forget you ever came here, or you can ask questions. And if you ask questions, you will not like the answers." Dorothy stared at him, her mind racing. She thought of Eddie, of the photographs, of the filing cabinet filled with secrets, of Father Giuseppe's trembling hands. "What was Eddie to you?" she asked. Vincent's eyes darkened. "He was a man who kept his mouth shut. That is the highest compliment I can give. And if I don't keep mine shut?" Vincent smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you'll find out why Eddie never brought you here." He turned and walked back toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. At the top, he paused and looked back. "Lock the door behind you, Mrs. Hale, and don't come back." Then he was gone. Dorothy stood alone in the basement, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She looked at the photographs on the corkboard, at the filing cabinet, at the chains hanging from the ceiling, and she realized that Eddie had not left her an inheritance. He had left her a warning. Dorothy did not sleep that night. She sat in her kitchen, the lights off, staring at the envelope that had brought her to the garage. Vincent Carbone's words echoed in her mind, over and over, like a prayer she could not escape. He was a man who kept his mouth shut. Eddie had kept his mouth shut. For 43 years he had kept his mouth shut. And now Dorothy understood why. Because silence was survival. But Eddie was dead, and Dorothy was not sure she wanted to survive if survival meant living in the shadow of secrets she did not understand. She thought about calling the police. She thought about packing a bag and leaving Newark, leaving the garage, leaving everything behind. But she knew with a certainty that settled in her bones like ice that neither of those things would save her. Vincent Carbone had let her walk out of that basement. That meant something. It meant she was being watched. It meant her choices were no longer her own. At 3 in the morning, Dorothy made a decision. She would go back to the garage, not to run, not to hide, but to understand. Because if Eddie had died keeping secrets, then those secrets had killed him. And Dorothy would not die the same way. The next morning, Dorothy walked to St. Anthony's Chapel. She had not been to confession in years. Eddie had never been a religious man, and Dorothy had stopped going to Mass after her mother died. But Father Giuseppe had been at Eddie's funeral, and he had trembled when he blessed the grave, and Dorothy knew that trembling had not been fear of God. It had been fear of men. The chapel was empty when Dorothy arrived. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the pews. The smell of incense lingered in the air, faint and ghostly. Dorothy walked down the center aisle and stopped in front of the confessional booth. She hesitated, then pulled aside the curtain and stepped inside. The space was small and dark, the wooden bench worn smooth by decades of penitence. Dorothy sat down and waited. For a long moment there was only silence. Then she heard movement on the other side of the partition, the soft rustle of fabric, the creak of old wood. Father Giuseppe's voice came through the screen, low and careful. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Dorothy blinked. "Father, it's me, Dorothy Hale." There was a pause. "I know who you are," Father Giuseppe said quietly. "Then you know why I'm here." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Hale, there are some things that are better left unknown." "Eddie's dead," Dorothy said. "I think I deserve to know why." Father Giuseppe sighed, a sound so heavy it seemed to fill the small space. "Eddie died because he was loyal. That is all you need to know." "No," Dorothy said, her voice firm. "It's not." Silence. Then Father Giuseppe spoke again, his voice softer now, tinged with something that might have been regret. "What did you find in the garage?" Dorothy's breath caught. "You know about the garage." "I know many things, Mrs. Hale. I have heard many confessions. I have blessed many graves. I have kept many secrets." "Then tell me Eddie's secret." "I cannot." "Why not?" "Because I made a vow." "To who? To God? Or to the Carbone family?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Father Giuseppe did not answer. Dorothy leaned closer to the partition. "I met Vincent Carbone last night. He told me Eddie was loyal. He told me Eddie kept his mouth shut. But he didn't tell me what Eddie did. He didn't tell me why Eddie had photographs of men who disappear. He didn't tell me why there are chains in that basement. Mrs. Hale, tell me the truth, Father, or I'll go to the police." "The police cannot help you." "Then who can?" Silence again. And then finally Father Giuseppe spoke. "No one." Dorothy felt something break inside her. Not her resolve, but her hope. She stood to leave, but Father Giuseppe's voice stopped her. "Wait." Dorothy froze. "Sit down, Mrs. Hale, please." She sat. Father Giuseppe's voice was barely a whisper now, as if he feared the walls themselves might hear him. Eddie Hale was not a soldier. He was not a killer. He was a mechanic, a good one, the best in Newark, and that is why they used him. Used him for what? For things that needed to disappear. Dorothy's stomach turned. "Cars," Father Giuseppe continued. "Stolen cars. Cars used in jobs. Cars that needed to be stripped, repainted, hidden. Eddie's garage was a place where things went to be forgotten, and Eddie was very good at making things disappear. And the photographs? Eddie kept records. He was a careful man. He documented everything. Not because he wanted to, but because Vincent Carbone told him to. Vincent wanted insurance. He wanted leverage. He wanted to make sure that if anyone talked, Eddie would have proof of who they were. So Eddie was a witness. Yes. And now he's dead." Father Giuseppe did not answer. Dorothy's hands clenched into fists. "Who killed him?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do. Mrs. Hale, Even if I knew, I could not tell you. There are rules in this world, rules older than the law, rules that cannot be broken without consequence. Omerta, Dorothy whispered. Yes, Dorothy had heard the word before, the code of silence, the law of the Mafia. To speak was to die. But Eddie's dead anyway, Dorothy said, so the code didn't protect him. No, Father Giuseppe said softly. It didn't. Dorothy felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not cry. Not here. Not now. What should I do, Father? Father Giuseppe was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Sell the garage. Take the money. Leave Newark. Do not look back. And if I don't, then you will end up like Eddie. Dorothy stood. She pulled aside the curtain and stepped out of the confessional. She turned to look back at the booth, at the shadow of Father Giuseppe behind the partition. Eddie deserved better than this, she said. Yes, Father Giuseppe said. He did. Dorothy walked out of the chapel and into the cold morning air. She stood on the steps for a long moment, looking out at the street, at the city, at the life she had lived for 68 years, and she made a decision. She would not sell the garage. She would not leave Newark. She would not forget, because Eddie had kept his mouth shut, and it had killed him, and Dorothy would not make the same mistake. When Dorothy returned to the garage, she found the side door unlocked. She had locked it the night before. She was certain of it. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding. The garage was dark, but she could see movement in the shadows. Someone was inside. Dorothy reached for the light switch, but a voice stopped her. Don't. The voice was rough, low, familiar. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was younger than Vincent Carbone, maybe in his 40s, with a thick build and a face that looked like it had been broken and reset more than once. He wore a leather jacket over a stained white shirt, and his hands were scarred and calloused. Dorothy recognized him from the photographs in the basement. Sal Torino. You're Eddie's widow, Sal said. It was not a question. This is my property, Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. You're trespassing. Sal smiled, but there was no humor in it. Trespassing. That's a good word. You a lawyer, Mrs. Hale? Get out. Sal took a step closer. I don't think you understand the situation here. This garage, it's not yours, it never was. Eddie held it for the family. And now that Eddie's gone, it belongs to the family again. The deed says otherwise. The deed don't mean shit if you're not alive to hold it. Dorothy's breath caught, but she did not move. She had faced men like Sal before. Men who thought they could scare her because she was old, because she was a woman, because she was alone. But Dorothy had buried her husband 2 weeks ago and she had nothing left to lose. If you're going to kill me, she said calmly, then do it. But don't waste my time with threats. Sal stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound. You got balls, old woman, I'll give you that. What do you want, Mr. Torino? Sal's smile faded. I want what's mine. Eddie had something that belongs to me, something he was holding, and I want it back. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You've been down in the basement, you've seen the files, you've seen the photographs. Eddie kept records, and one of those records is mine. I want it. Dorothy's mind raced. She thought of the filing cabinet, the folders, the receipts and manifests. She had only looked at one. How many more were there? And what did they contain? I don't know which file is yours, Dorothy said carefully. Then you better start looking. And if I don't? Sal's eyes darkened. Then Vincent Carbone's gonna come back here and ask you himself. And trust me, Mrs. Hale, you don't want that. He turned and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. You got 2 days. Find my file. Burn it. And then we never have to see each other again. He left, and the door swung shut behind him. Dorothy stood in the darkness, her heart pounding, her mind racing. 2 days. She had 2 days to find Sal Torino's file. 2 days to decide whether to destroy it or use it. 2 days to figure out what Eddie had been hiding and why it had gotten him killed. Dorothy locked the door and walked down into the basement. She opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the first folder, and she began to read. The files were meticulous. Eddie had documented everything, every car that came through the garage, every man who dropped it off, every transaction, every payment, every name. And more than that, he had documented things that should never have been written down. Dates of disappearances, locations of safe houses, names of witnesses who had suddenly stopped talking. Dorothy read through folder after folder, her hands trembling, her mind reeling. Eddie had not just been a mechanic. He had been an archivist, a keeper of secrets, and these secrets could destroy the Carbone family. She found Sal Torino's file near the bottom of the drawer. It was thicker than the others. Inside were receipts, photographs, and something else, a handwritten letter. Dorothy unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written in haste or fear. To whoever finds this, my name is Marco De Luca. I worked for Sal Torino. I did what he told me to do. I kept my mouth shut, but I saw things. I saw him kill a man in the back of Eddie Hale's garage. I saw him dump the body in the river. I saw him threaten Eddie, tell him to keep quiet or end up the same way. I can't live with this anymore. I'm going to the police. If I disappear, you'll know why. Marco De Luca, August 14, 2024. Dorothy's hands went numb. Marco De Luca had disappeared 3 months ago. She had seen his name in the newspaper. Another unsolved case. Another man who had vanished without a trace, and Sal Torino had killed him. Dorothy sat on the cold concrete floor, the letter in her hands, and for the first time since Eddie's funeral she wept. Not for Eddie, not for herself, but for Marco De Luca, and for all the men like him who had died because they had seen too much, because they had known too much, because they had believed that the truth could save them. When Dorothy finally stopped crying, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the file. Then she stood, walked up the stairs and locked the basement door. She had 2 days, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. Dorothy spent the next day in the basement of the garage, reading through Eddie's files with a methodical precision that surprised even herself. She had always been good with details. It was a trait Eddie had loved about her, her ability to remember dates, to keep accounts, to notice when something was out of place. Now that skill was the only thing keeping her alive. She read about shipments that never arrived, about men who were paid for services they never performed, about cars that were registered to people who had been dead for years. Eddie had documented it all, and the deeper Dorothy went, the clearer the picture became. The Carbone family was not just a criminal organization, it was a machine, and Eddie's garage had been one of its most important gears. But machines could be broken. And Eddie had kept the blueprints. Dorothy found files on nearly every major figure in the Carbone family. Sal Torino's file was damning, but it was not the only one. There were files on captains, soldiers, associates, men whose names appeared in police reports, but who had never been convicted. Men whose businesses were fronts for laundering money, for trafficking goods, for making problems disappear. And then there was Vincent Carbone's file. It was the last one in the cabinet, the thickest, the most carefully organized. Dorothy pulled it out and sat down at the workbench. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Vincent standing outside restaurants, Vincent shaking hands with politicians, Vincent at weddings, at funerals, at charity events, always in the background, always watching, and beneath the photographs were documents, financial records, transcripts of phone calls, letters written in Vincent's own hand. Dorothy read one of the letters slowly, her breath catching with every line. To Don Carbone, the situation with Eddie Hale is under control. He has proven himself loyal and discreet. He understands the cost of silence and has demonstrated his willingness to pay it. I recommend we continue using his garage for sensitive operations. He is reliable and, more importantly, he is invisible. However, I must advise caution. Eddie is not a soldier. He is a civilian. If pressure is applied, there is no guarantee he will remain silent. I suggest we ensure his loyalty through alternative means. His wife, Dorothy, could serve as leverage should the need arise. Respectfully, Vincent Carbone. Dorothy's vision blurred. She read the letter again and then a third time, as if reading it enough times might change the words written there. Vincent Carbone had suggested using her as leverage against Eddie. Eddie had known. He must have known. And he had kept her in the dark, not out of cruelty but out of love, because as long as she knew nothing, she could not be used. But now Eddie was dead, and Dorothy knew everything. She closed the file and sat in the silence of the basement, her mind racing. She thought about Sal Torino's threat. She thought about Father Giuseppe's warning. She thought about Vincent Carbone's cold, measured voice. You have a choice, Mrs. Hale. But Dorothy did not feel like she had a choice. Not anymore. She stood, gathered the files and placed them back in the cabinet. Then she locked it, climbed the stairs and walked out of the garage into the grey November afternoon. She had made a decision. She would not give Sal Torino his file. She would give it to Vincent Carbone. Dorothy did not know where Vincent Carbone lived, but she knew someone who did. She returned to St. Anthony's Chapel that evening and waited in the last pew until the evening mass ended and the parishioners filed out. Father Giuseppe emerged from the sacristy, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn with exhaustion. He saw Dorothy and stopped. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Father Giuseppe walked down the aisle and sat beside her. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "I need to speak with Vincent Carbone." Father Giuseppe closed his eyes. "Mrs. Hale, I need to speak with him, Father, and you're going to tell me how." "I cannot." "Yes, you can, and you will. Because if you don't, I'm going to take every file in that garage and I'm going to walk into the nearest police station and I'm going to give them everything." Father Giuseppe's eyes snapped open. "You would be dead before you reached the door." "Then at least I'll die doing something Eddie was too afraid to do." Father Giuseppe stared at her, his expression torn between pity and fear. Then he sighed and looked down at his hands. "Vincent Carbone does not take meetings, especially not with widows who have no business knowing his name. Then you'll arrange it." "Mrs. Hale, you owe Eddie this, Father. You heard his confessions. You knew what he was doing, and you did nothing to stop it, so now you're going to help me." Father Giuseppe was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "I will make a call, but I cannot guarantee he will agree to see you, and if he does, I cannot guarantee your safety." "I don't need your guarantee, Father. I just need a phone number." Father Giuseppe stood and walked to the sacristy. Dorothy waited in the pew, her heart pounding, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. 5 minutes later, Father Giuseppe returned. He handed Dorothy a slip of paper with a phone number written in careful, deliberate script. "Call this number. Tell them you need to speak with Vincent. They will ask your name. Give it, and then wait." Dorothy took the paper. "Thank you, Father." "Do not thank me, Mrs. Hale. If this goes wrong, it will be on my conscience." "Then let's hope it goes right." Dorothy stood and walked out of the chapel. She did not look back. Dorothy called the number from a payphone 2 blocks from her apartment. A man answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Yeah, I need to speak with Vincent Carbone." "Who's asking?" "Dorothy Hale." There was a pause. Dorothy could hear muffled voices in the background, as if the man had covered the receiver with his hand. Then he came back on the line. "Wait there." The line went dead. Dorothy hung up the phone and leaned against the wall of the phone booth. She did not know if she had made the right decision. She did not know if Vincent would agree to see her. She did not know if she would survive the night, but she knew she could not go back. 15 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and a man in a dark suit looked out at her. "Mrs. Hale?" Dorothy nodded. "Get in." Dorothy hesitated, then opened the door and slid into the back seat. The man in the front passenger seat turned to look at her. He was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and a scar running down the side of his jaw. "You got a death wish, lady?" he asked. Dorothy did not answer. The driver pulled away from the curb and the sedan merged into traffic. Dorothy watched the city pass by outside the window, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. They drove for 20 minutes, leaving the industrial district behind and entering a neighborhood Dorothy had only ever seen in photographs. The houses here were large, old, surrounded by iron gates and tall hedges. The streets were quiet, empty, as if the people who lived here had learned long ago that silence was the price of safety. The sedan pulled into the driveway of a mansion at the end of a tree-lined street. The house was 3 stories tall, built of dark brick, with tall windows that glowed with warm light. The front door was flanked by stone columns, and a fountain stood in the center of the circular driveway, its water frozen in the November cold. The driver got out and opened Dorothy's door. She stepped out, her legs unsteady, and followed him up the steps to the front door. The door opened before they reached it. A man stood in the doorway, older, distinguished, dressed in a dark suit and tie. Vincent Carbone. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I did not expect to see you again so soon. I need to talk to you." "So I gathered." Vincent stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "Come in." Dorothy walked into the house and the door closed behind her. The interior of the mansion was as imposing as the exterior. The floors were polished marble, the walls lined with dark wood paneling and oil paintings in gilded frames. A chandelier hung from the ceiling of the foyer, its crystals catching the light and scattering it across the room. Vincent led Dorothy down a long hallway and into a study. The room was warm, lit by a fire crackling in a stone fireplace. The walls were lined with bookshelves and a large desk sat in the center of the room, its surface clean and uncluttered. Vincent gestured to a leather chair in front of the desk. "Sit." Dorothy sat. Vincent walked around the desk and sat in the chair opposite her. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at her with the same calm, unreadable expression he had worn in the basement of the garage. "You wanted to talk," he said. "So, talk." Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out Sal Torino's file. She placed it on the desk between them. Vincent glanced at the file but did not touch it. "Sal came to see me," Dorothy said. "He told me Eddie had something that belonged to him. He told me to find it and burn it. And instead you brought it to me." "Yes." "Why?" Dorothy met his gaze. "Because I want to know who killed Eddie." Vincent's expression did not change. "And you think Sal killed him?" "I think Sal had a reason to." Vincent leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Hale, there are many people who had reasons to want Eddie dead. Sal Torino is just one of them." "Then tell me who else." "Why should I?" "Because Eddie was loyal to you. He kept your secrets. He did what you told him to do. And now he's dead, and I want to know why." Vincent was silent for a long moment. Then he reached forward and opened the file. He flipped through the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. When he reached Marco De Luca's letter, he stopped. He read it once. Then he closed the file and looked up at Dorothy. "You've read this?" "Yes." "Then you know what it means?" "Yes." Vincent nodded slowly. "Sal Torino is a problem. He has been for some time. He is ambitious, reckless. He does not understand the value of patience." "Did he kill Eddie?" Vincent's eyes darkened. "I don't know, but I intend to find out. And what happens to me? That depends." "On what?" "On whether you can keep your mouth shut." Dorothy's hands clenched in her lap. "I can." "Can you?" Vincent leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Because you've already broken omerta, Mrs. Hale. You've come to me with evidence of a crime. You've involved yourself in matters that do not concern you. And now you're sitting in my house, asking me questions you have no right to ask. Eddie was my husband, and he is dead, and nothing you do will bring him back." Dorothy's voice was steady. "I'm not trying to bring him back. I'm trying to make sure his death meant something." Vincent studied her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the fireplace. He stared into the flames, his hands clasped behind his back. "Eddie was a good man," he said quietly. "Loyal, reliable. He understood the rules, and he followed them. That is why I trusted him. That is why I protected him." "You didn't protect him enough." Vincent turned to look at her. "No, I didn't." Silence hung between them. Then Vincent walked back to the desk and picked up the file. "I will deal with Sal Torino. You will not see him again, and you will not speak of this to anyone. Not to the police, not to Father Giuseppe, not to anyone." "And what do I get in return?" Vincent smiled faintly. "You get to live, Mrs. Hale. Is that not enough?" Dorothy stood. "I want the truth. I want to know who killed Eddie. And I want justice." "Justice?" Vincent's smile faded. "There is no justice in this world, Mrs. Hale. Only consequences." He walked to the door and opened it. The man who had driven Dorothy to the mansion stood in the hallway, waiting. "Take Mrs. Hale home," Vincent said. Dorothy walked to the door, then paused and looked back at Vincent. "Eddie kept files on everyone," she said, "including you." Vincent's expression did not change. "I know." "And you're not worried?" "No." "Why not?" Vincent's eyes met hers, and for the first time Dorothy saw something behind the calm, measured facade, something cold and unyielding. "Because if those files ever see the light of day, Mrs. Hale, you will be the first one to die." Dorothy held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked out of the study. As the sedan pulled away from the mansion, Dorothy looked back at the house, at the glowing windows, at the figure of Vincent Carbone standing in the doorway. She had made a deal with a monster, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never be free of him. Dorothy did not hear from Vincent Carbone for 3 days. She spent those days in her apartment, the curtains drawn, the door locked. She did not answer the phone. She did not go outside. She sat at her kitchen table and waited, because waiting was all she could do. She thought about Eddie, about the files, about Marco De Luca's letter, about Vincent Carbone's cold, unwavering gaze. If those files ever see the light of day, you will be the first one to die. Dorothy had no doubt that Vincent meant what he said, but she also knew that Eddie had kept those files for a reason, not as blackmail, not as leverage, but as insurance. And now that insurance belonged to Dorothy. On the 4th day, there was a knock at the door. Dorothy froze. She sat in the kitchen, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat, waiting for the knock to come again. It did, 3 times, slow and deliberate. Dorothy stood and walked to the door. She looked through the peephole and saw a man standing in the hallway, young, well-dressed, the same man who had driven her to Vincent's mansion. She opened the door, leaving the chain lock in place. "Mrs. Hale," the man said, "Vincent wants to see you." "When?" "Now." Dorothy hesitated. "Is it about Sal?" The man's expression did not change. "Vincent will explain." Dorothy nodded. She closed the door, unlatched the chain, and followed the man down the stairs and out to the black sedan waiting at the curb. This time they did not go to Vincent's mansion. They drove to the industrial district, to a part of Newark Dorothy had never seen before. The buildings here were older, abandoned, their windows shattered and their walls covered in graffiti. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the highway. The sedan pulled into an alley behind a warehouse and stopped. The man in the passenger seat got out and opened Dorothy's door. "This way," he said. Dorothy followed him through a rusted metal door and into the warehouse. The interior was dark, lit only by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled of mold and decay, and Dorothy could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the shadows. Vincent Carbone stood in the center of the warehouse, his hands in the pockets of his long coat. Beside him stood another man, older, heavier, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Dorothy recognized him from Eddie's files. Don Carbone. The Don did not acknowledge Dorothy's presence. He simply stood there, silent and still, his gaze fixed on something in the shadows at the far end of the warehouse. Vincent turned as Dorothy approached. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "thank you for coming. Do I have a choice?" Vincent smiled faintly. "No." He gestured for her to follow him, and Dorothy walked deeper into the warehouse. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw what the Don had been looking at. A man was tied to a chair in the center of the room. His head hung forward, his face bruised and swollen. Blood dripped from his nose onto his shirt. Sal Torino. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. Vincent stopped a few feet away from Sal and looked at Dorothy. "You wanted to know who killed Eddie. I wanted to know the same thing. So I asked Sal." Dorothy's voice was barely a whisper. "What did he say?" "He denied it, of course, but denial is easy when you have nothing to lose." Vincent walked over to Sal and grabbed him by the hair, lifting his head so that his swollen eyes were forced open. "So I gave him something to lose." Sal's eyes found Dorothy, and for a moment, something like recognition flickered in them. Then Vincent released his grip, and Sal's head dropped forward again. Dorothy felt sick. She wanted to turn away, to leave, to run, but her legs would not move. Vincent walked back to her. "Sal Torino killed Marco DeLuca. That much is true. He killed him because Marco was going to talk, and he would have killed Eddie too if Eddie had not already been dead." "Then who killed Eddie?" Dorothy asked, her voice shaking. Vincent's expression darkened. "That is the question, isn't it?" He turned and nodded to the man who had driven Dorothy here. The man walked over to Sal, pulled a knife from his belt, and cut the ropes binding him to the chair. Sal slumped forward, gasping for air. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the concrete floor. Vincent walked over and crouched beside him. "You have a choice, Sal. Tell me who killed Eddie Hale, and I will let you walk out of here. Lie to me, and you will die in this warehouse, and no one will ever find your body." Sal coughed, blood spraying from his lips. "I didn't kill him." "Then who did?" Sal looked up at Vincent, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know." "Wrong answer." Vincent stood and walked away. The man with the knife stepped forward. "Wait," Sal gasped. "Wait, please." Vincent stopped. Sal struggled to sit up, his hands shaking. "I don't know who killed him, but I know who wanted him dead." "Who?" Sal's gaze flickered to Dorothy, then back to Vincent. "You." The warehouse fell silent. Vincent turned slowly to look at Sal. "What did you say?" "You wanted Eddie dead. You told me so yourself. You said he was a liability. You said he knew too much. You said—" Vincent moved so fast that Dorothy barely saw it. He crossed the distance between himself and Sal in 2 strides, grabbed him by the throat, and lifted him off the ground. "I never gave that order," Vincent said, his voice cold and deadly. Sal clawed at Vincent's hand, his face turning red, then purple. "You didn't have to. Everyone knew. Everyone knew Eddie was a problem. Everyone knew he had to go." Vincent stared at him for a long moment. Then he released his grip and Sal collapsed back onto the floor, gasping for air. Vincent turned to the Don. "Did you know about this?" The Don's expression did not change. I knew Eddie Hale was documenting our operations. I knew it was a risk, but I did not order his death. Then who did? The Don's gaze shifted to Sal. Ask him. Vincent turned back to Sal. Who gave the order? Sal shook his head, tears streaming down his bruised face. No one gave the order, but everyone knew. And someone acted. Who? I don't know. I swear to God, I don't know. Vincent stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded to the man with the knife. Take him out back. Make it quick. No, Sal screamed. No, please, I'm telling the truth. I don't know who killed him, I swear. The man grabbed Sal by the arm and dragged him toward the back of the warehouse. Sal's screams echoed through the empty space, growing fainter and fainter, until they were cut off by the sound of a single gunshot. Silence. Dorothy felt her knees buckle, but she forced herself to stay upright. She would not collapse. She would not show weakness. Not here. Not now. Vincent walked back to her. I'm sorry you had to see that. Dorothy's voice was hollow. Are you? Yes. Vincent's eyes were hard, but there was something behind them, something that might have been regret. Sal Torino was a problem. He killed Marco De Luca. He threatened you. He disrespected the family. He had to be dealt with. And Eddie? Eddie was killed by someone in the family, someone who believed he was a threat, but I do not know who. Then what am I supposed to do? Vincent looked at her for a long moment. You go home, Mrs. Hale. You lock your doors, and you forget about Eddie's files. Forget about this garage. Forget about all of it. And if I don't? Vincent's expression hardened. Then you will end up like Sal. He turned and walked toward the door. The Don followed, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Dorothy stood alone in the warehouse, the smell of blood and gunpowder heavy in the air. She thought about Eddie, about the files, about Marco De Luca, about Sal Torino, and she thought about Vincent's words. Eddie was killed by someone in the family, someone who believed he was a threat. But Vincent had not said he would find that person. He had not said he would bring them to justice. He had simply said to forget. And Dorothy knew with a certainty that settled in her bones like ice that Vincent did not want to know who had killed Eddie. Because if he found out, he would have to punish them. And whoever had killed Eddie was someone Vincent could not afford to lose. Dorothy returned to the garage that night. She unlocked the basement door and descended the stairs. The filing cabinet stood in the corner, silent and waiting. Dorothy opened it and pulled out Vincent Carbone's file. She carried it to the workbench and spread the documents across the surface. She read through them slowly, carefully, looking for something she had missed. A name, a date, a clue. And then she found it. A photograph, tucked between two financial records. A photograph of Eddie standing outside the garage, talking to a man Dorothy had never seen before. The man was younger than Eddie, mid-40s perhaps, tall and thin with sharp features and cold eyes. He wore a tailored suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to being obeyed. On the back of the photograph, in Eddie's handwriting, were 3 words: the consigliere's nephew. Dorothy's hands began to shake. The consigliere, Father Giuseppe. Dorothy turned the photograph over and stared at the man's face. She had never seen him before, but she knew with absolute certainty that this was the man who had killed Eddie, because Eddie had known something about him, something dangerous, something that could not be allowed to exist. And Father Giuseppe, who had heard Eddie's confessions, who had known Eddie's secrets, who had trembled at Eddie's funeral, had allowed it to happen. Dorothy folded the photograph carefully and placed it in her purse. Then she closed the file, returned it to the cabinet and locked it. She climbed the stairs and walked out of the garage into the cold November night. She knew what she had to do. She had to confront Father Giuseppe, and she had to do it before Vincent Carbone found out. Dorothy arrived at St. Anthony's Chapel just after midnight. The doors were locked, but she knew where Father Giuseppe kept the spare key. She had watched Eddie retrieve it once years ago, when they had come to the chapel for a friend's funeral. She unlocked the side door and slipped inside. The chapel was dark and silent. The smell of incense hung in the air, faint and ghostly. Dorothy walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. She stopped in front of the altar and looked up at the crucifix hanging above it. The figure of Christ looked down at her, his face frozen in eternal suffering. "Forgive me, Father," Dorothy whispered, "for what I'm about to do." She turned and walked toward the sacristy. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Father Giuseppe was sitting at his desk, his head bowed, his hands folded in prayer. He looked up as Dorothy entered and his face went pale. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" Dorothy closed the door behind her. "I came to ask you a question, Father. This is not the time." "Who killed Eddie?" Father Giuseppe's expression crumbled. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." "Mrs. Hale." Dorothy pulled the photograph from her purse and placed it on the desk in front of him. "Who is this man?" Father Giuseppe looked down at the photograph and all the color drained from his face. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "From Eddie's files. He documented everything, Father, including your nephew." Father Giuseppe's hands began to shake. "You don't understand? Then help me understand." Father Giuseppe closed his eyes. "My nephew, Antonio, he works for the family. He is the Don's enforcer. He deals with problems. And Eddie was a problem. Why? Because Eddie knew things about Antonio, about the family, about me." "What things?" Father Giuseppe looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I heard confessions, Mrs. Hale. For 40 years I heard confessions, and I kept their secrets, because that is what a priest does. But Eddie knew that I had broken the seal of confession. He knew that I had told Antonio things I should not have told him, and he threatened to expose me." Dorothy's breath caught. "So Antonio killed him. I didn't order it, I swear to God I didn't order it, but Antonio, he believed he was protecting me. He believed he was doing what was necessary. And you let him." Father Giuseppe buried his face in his hands. "I didn't know what to do. I was afraid. I was weak. You let my husband die," Dorothy said, her voice cold and hard. "You let him die to protect yourself." Father Giuseppe looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Dorothy stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the door. "What are you going to do?" Father Giuseppe called after her. Dorothy stopped. She looked back at him, at the broken man sitting behind the desk, at the man who had traded Eddie's life for his own silence. "I'm going to do what Eddie couldn't," she said. "I'm going to tell the truth." She walked out of the sacristy and left Father Giuseppe alone in the darkness. As she stepped out of the chapel into the cold night air, Dorothy knew that her life, whatever remained of it, would never be the same. She had the truth now, and the truth was a weapon she intended to use. Dorothy did not go home that night. She walked through the streets of Newark, her coat pulled tight against the November cold, the photograph of Antonio in her purse. She walked past shuttered storefronts and empty lots, past buildings that had once been full of life and were now nothing more than monuments to a city that had been left behind. She thought about Eddie, about the 43 years they had spent together, about the silence that had defined their marriage, about the secrets he had kept to protect her, and she thought about Father Giuseppe, broken and weeping in the sacristy, confessing his sins to a woman who could never absolve him. Dorothy had the truth now. She knew who had killed Eddie. She knew why. But knowing the truth was not the same as having justice, and Dorothy wanted justice. She walked until dawn broke over the city, casting pale grey light across the streets. Then she returned to the garage. The basement was cold and silent. Dorothy descended the stairs and stood in front of the filing cabinet. She had read through these files a dozen times, but she had been looking for the wrong thing. She had been looking for evidence of crimes, for proof of guilt, for names and dates and transactions that could be used to destroy the Carbone family. But the files were not evidence. They were a map of every weakness, every secret, every vulnerability in the Carbone family's carefully constructed empire. Eddie had not documented these things out of fear or out of loyalty. He had documented them because he had known even then that one day someone would need them, and that someone was Dorothy. She pulled Vincent Carbone's file from the cabinet and opened it. She read through the financial records, the transcripts of phone calls, the letters written in Vincent's own hand. And then she found what she was looking for. A single sheet of paper folded in half, tucked between 2 pages of bank statements. It was a handwritten note, not from Eddie, from someone else. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, the ink smudged in places as if the writer had been in a hurry. "Vincent, I know what you're planning. I know about the shipment. I know about the route. I know about the men you're paying off. And I know you're planning to cut the Don out of the deal. If you go through with this, I will tell him everything, and you will be dead by morning. Think carefully. E.H. Eddie Hale." Dorothy read the note again, her hands trembling. Eddie had known about Vincent's betrayal. He had known that Vincent was planning to move against the Don, and he had threatened to expose him. And Vincent had let him live, not out of loyalty, not out of respect, but because Eddie had leverage, and now that leverage belonged to Dorothy. She folded the note carefully and placed it back in the file. Then she pulled out another file, Antonio's file. It was thin, much thinner than the others, but inside was everything Dorothy needed. Photographs of Antonio at crime scenes, receipts for payments made to him by the family, a list of names, men who had disappeared, men who had been killed, men who had crossed the family and paid the price, and at the bottom of the file, another handwritten note. This one from Eddie. Antonio Giuseppe is the Don's enforcer. He has killed 12 men that I know of. He is dangerous, he is loyal, and he is Father Giuseppe's nephew. If anything happens to me, it will be him. Dorothy closed the file and sat down on the cold concrete floor. Eddie had known. He had known that Antonio would kill him. He had known that Father Giuseppe would allow it to happen, and he had written it down because he had known that Dorothy would find it. He had left her the truth, and now it was her responsibility to decide what to do with it. Dorothy returned to her apartment and made a phone call, the same number Father Giuseppe had given her, the number that connected her to Vincent Carbone. A man answered on the second ring. Yeah? I need to speak with Vincent Carbone. Who's asking? Dorothy Hale. There was a pause. Then the man said, Wait. Dorothy waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally the man came back on the line. Be at the warehouse on Crescent Street at noon. Come alone. The line went dead. Dorothy hung up the phone and looked at the clock. It was 9 in the morning. She had 3 hours. She spent those hours preparing. She took a shower. She dressed carefully. She ate a small meal, though she could barely taste it. And then she went to the garage one last time. She unlocked the basement door and descended the stairs. She opened the filing cabinet and removed 3 files. Vincent Carbone's file, Antonio Giuseppe's file, and one more, the Don's file. She placed them in a leather satchel Eddie had kept in the garage. Then she climbed the stairs, locked the door, and walked out into the cold November air. The warehouse on Crescent Street was empty when Dorothy arrived. She stood in the center of the space, the satchel in her hands, and waited. At exactly noon, the metal door at the back of the warehouse opened, and Vincent Carbone walked in. He was alone. He stopped a few feet away from Dorothy and looked at her with the same calm, unreadable expression he had worn the first time they met. Mrs. Hale, he said, you're persistent. I'll give you that. I know who killed Eddie. Vincent's expression did not change. So do I. Then why haven't you done anything about it? Because the man who killed Eddie is valuable, and I do not punish valuable men without good reason. He killed my husband, yes. And your husband was documenting my operations. Your husband was a threat, and threats must be dealt with. Dorothy's hands tightened on the satchel. Eddie wasn't a threat. He was loyal. He was loyal until he wasn't. Vincent took a step closer. Eddie Hale threatened to expose me, Mrs. Hale. He knew about a shipment I was planning. A shipment that would have made me a very wealthy man. And he told me that if I went through with it, he would tell the Don. So I made a choice. I could kill Eddie myself, or I could let someone else do it. Antonio. Yes. And Father Giuseppe. Father Giuseppe told Antonio that Eddie was a problem, and Antonio dealt with that problem. It was convenient, clean, and it left no connection to me. Dorothy's voice was cold. You let an innocent man die to protect yourself. I let a man who threatened me die to protect my interests. There is a difference. Dorothy stared at him for a long moment. Then she opened the satchel and pulled out Vincent's file. She held it up so he could see it. Eddie documented everything, she said, including your plan to betray the Don. He wrote it all down, and now I have it. Vincent's eyes darkened. What do you want, Mrs. Hale? I want justice. There is no justice in this world. Then I'll settle for revenge. Dorothy pulled out Antonio's file and placed it on top of Vincent's. Antonio killed Eddie. Father Giuseppe allowed it to happen. And you orchestrated the whole thing. You're all guilty. And what do you plan to do with those files? Take them to the police? They won't believe you. And even if they did, you would be dead before they could act. I'm not taking them to the police. Vincent's expression shifted. For the first time, Dorothy saw something that might have been fear in his eyes. Then who? Dorothy pulled out the third file, the Don's file. I'm giving them to Don Carbone. Vincent's face went pale. You wouldn't. I would. Mrs. Hale, if you do this, the Don will kill me. He will kill Antonio, he will kill Father Giuseppe, and he will kill you. Then we'll all get what we deserve. Vincent took a step forward. You don't understand what you're doing. The Don is not a forgiving man. If he learns that I was planning to move against him, he will not just kill me. He will destroy everything I've built. He will go after my family, my associates, everyone I've ever cared about. Good. Vincent stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. You would sacrifice yourself just to destroy me? Yes. For a long moment, Vincent said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. You're crazier than I thought. Maybe. Dorothy's voice was steady. But I'm not the one who killed an innocent man to protect my own interests. I'm not the one who let a priest's nephew become a murderer. And I'm not the one who betrayed the man who trusted me. Vincent's smile faded. What do you want? I want Antonio dead. I want Father Giuseppe to confess. And I want you to live with the knowledge that Eddie Hale was a better man than you will ever be. Vincent's jaw tightened. I can't kill Antonio. He's the Don's enforcer. If I move against him, the Don will know. Then tell the Don the truth. Tell him that Antonio killed Eddie without orders. Tell him that Antonio is a liability, and let the Don deal with him. And what about Father Giuseppe? Father Giuseppe will confess. I'll make sure of it. And me? Dorothy met his gaze. You live, but you live knowing that I have these files. And if anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I die in an accident, these files go to the Don and he will know everything. Vincent stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Mrs. Hale. Eddie taught me well. Vincent turned and walked toward the door. Then he stopped and looked back. I'll take care of Antonio, but after that we're done. You sell the garage, you leave Newark, and you never speak of this again. Agreed. Vincent nodded. Then he walked out of the warehouse and disappeared into the cold November afternoon. Dorothy stood alone in the silence, the files still clutched in her hands. She had done it. She had avenged Eddie. But as she walked out of the warehouse and into the fading light, she knew that the price of that vengeance would follow her for the rest of her life. Antonio Giuseppe was found dead 3 days later. His body was discovered in an alley behind a restaurant in the industrial district. He had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. The police ruled it a gang killing. No suspects were ever named. Father Giuseppe disappeared the same week. Some said he had been transferred to a monastery upstate. Others said he had simply walked away from the church and was never seen again. Dorothy did not ask. She sold the garage 2 weeks later. A man in a dark suit came to her apartment with a cashier's check and a contract. She signed the papers without reading them and took the money. She used it to buy a small house in Pennsylvania, far from Newark, far from the Carbone family, far from the life she had lived for 68 years. She lived quietly. She kept to herself. She did not make friends. She did not go to church. And every night, before she went to bed, she looked at the photograph of Eddie she kept on her nightstand. I did it, she whispered. I got justice for you. But Eddie did not answer, because Eddie was gone, and Dorothy was alone. 5 years passed. Dorothy Hale was 73 years old when the letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, delivered by a postal worker she did not recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in neat, unadorned text. Mrs. Hale, you kept your word. You did not speak. You did not betray us. And for that, I am grateful. Vincent Carbone is dead. He died of a heart attack last month. He was 72 years old. The Don attended his funeral. So did I. I am writing to tell you that your debt is paid. The files you held over Vincent's head died with him. You are free, but I want you to know something. Eddie Hale was a good man. He was loyal. He was careful. And he deserved better than the death he received. I did not kill him, but I allowed it to happen. And for that I am sorry. Live well, Mrs. Hale. You have earned it. Don Carbone. Dorothy read the letter 3 times. Then she walked to the fireplace and threw it into the flames. She watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening, the words disappearing into ash. When it was gone, she sat down in her chair and looked out the window at the quiet street, at the trees swaying in the wind, at the world that had moved on without her. She thought about Eddie, about the garage, about the files, and she thought about the words the Don had written. You are free. But Dorothy did not feel free. She felt like a woman who had spent 5 years waiting for a bullet that never came, and she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones like ice, that she would spend the rest of her life waiting, because the Carbone family did not forget, and the Carbone family did not forgive, but they did honor their debts, and Dorothy Hale had paid hers in full. The end.